Sponsors Matheson for like being incredibly generous to us. So. I call upon the HIS Record Secretary, Liam Brophy, to read the minutes of the last extraordinary joint public business meeting.
Is it Madam or Mr. Is it Sally? Great. Just check. Madam Speaker, a life based entirely on coercion is simply not worth living. Our burden in this round from government is that we don't care if states continue to secure the benefit of society, which we don't think it does anyway, and I'll get into that later. But we think that in order to be legitimate, a state needs to meet a higher burden. It needs to justify itself. Here's an example. I may have told Michael and Prep exactly what to say in his speech under threat that I'd be very upset if he didn't. My authority, however, is not legitimate because I didn't justify it. Good consequences are not enough to legitimize coercion. So, what is the state? The state we define as elites with a monopoly of force. In the UK, this is akin to the government. In Colombia, this is akin to FARC. So, the state defined in such a manner that it constantly oppresses marginalized groups. Sure.
Can you give us an example of some way of living that would be legitimate?
So, we think that the alternative isn't actually necessary for us in this round. After much discussion, we think something like anarchy is perfectly legitimate. Marginalized groups. Michael and I, are making these arguments, making this debate from an individual standpoint. This is important. So we don't think that the state will cease to exist. We recognize that the state has guns and will probably use them against us to shut us up. We still oppose it. So, arguments. So the first thing we would tell you is that the state only really enforces its authority through violence. We think that people obey the law because they are afraid of getting caught. No, thank you. So we think that even in a world where there's a minimal chance of getting caught all of the time for every time you break the law, we are told over and over again that we will get caught, that there will be bad consequences, and that the state has more authority than it actually does. We are tricked constantly every day by the state. We are coerced, and finally, we are not making decisions freely. No, thank you. So, how does the state trick people into believing that it works and also is necessary? Because, ladies and gentlemen, you all live under the illusion that you need the state to secure your freedom. You live under the illusion that you need the state for your education. We simply, Michael and I, do not think that this is the case. We think you can live perfectly happy on your own without the state tricking you and dictating to you what it is that you have to do, not right now. So how does it do this? First, through education systems, right? So you see all sorts of indoctrination through state-funded education systems all the time, and we don't get to question it. See previous round, right? Two, through the media and through the elites that control it and also control the state and this monopoly of power. So the media has an incentive to preserve the status quo that continues to benefit the elites that control it. So they continue to do things like gain favor, gain the things that we've decided as a society, because the state has told us to, is good, i.e. capital, which I'll get into in a minute. So we're told things like disorder is always wrong. We're also told that the sorts of people who are disadvantaged are less deserving than others through rhetoric such as you're poor or you don't have a job through your fault. It's not any fault of ours, it's your fault alone. Welfare is akin to handouts. Disadvantages are your fault and your fault alone. And when the state does anything to help you or to protect you, it's doing you a favor. It's not actually doing its duty.
Are you alright with individuals forming collectives or aggregating to fulfill a common purpose at all?
So we're okay with that as long as there is no elite with a monopoly of power within those collectives. We do think that eventually collectives get too large to avoid those sorts of things, so we don't actually see a world in which many large collectives are possible because they end up just being like states or quasi-states, whatever you want to call them. We're okay with a a world in which no elite has a monopoly on force. We envision that only as an anarchist one on our side of the house. So how else does the state trick people into thinking that it's actually necessary when Michael and I believe that it is not, and in fact, we contend that in this round? So language, and language through politicians. The language that politicians use and how that is burned into the public consciousness is particularly harmful. We think that politicians are held up to us from a very young age. This kind of dialogue constructs the notion of respect and authority and puts up politicians that fulfill that notion. Right? We also think, in general, these are highly gendered notions, see things as Ronald Reagan as the father of America, no thank you, Ashish. So people are given power not because we want them to, but because we've been told to give them power. Right? We haven't been told explicitly, give this person power, but we've been told these are the kinds of things that people in power should have, and look, there's a person who's been brought up through the state who meets all of those characteristics. We don't think we've actually freely chosen to give these people power. We've been coerced into thinking that these people ought to have power when there's no reason why we can't dictate our own lives on ourselves. Quickly under this point, let's talk about democracy, no thank you. So we think that the opposition might say, look, democratic ideals are completely counter to what you're saying, democracies work. We don't think this on our side of the house. We think that democracy actually limits a lot of the things that we think we're questioning, right? So they pretend to present alternatives to you, but these alternatives are marginal and small. Should we do things like build another free school in this neighborhood? Should we raise tax by like 0.1%, things like that? We think that these decisions are marginal and trick you into believing you are making decisions for yourself when you are truly not making decisions for yourself. And when you do make decisions for yourself, the state bows down on you with its heavy arm, both literally and metaphorically. We never get to question the state. So thirdly, we think of the construct of the state as exists as in vast majority of cases that is oppressive to certain groups, so it benefits specific groups in way in which it's constructed. For example, see labor versus capital. In 191 of 192 states, we benefit capital over labor. The sole exception is North Korea. We don't think that they're like the paradigm of equality and happiness there. So laborers are always oppressed, and it's never justified why labor isn't as important as individual capital. Very quickly, let me get that this is the problem, right? The big problem is that society can never escape this. I'm giving you this speech, but I know I will never escape this because of the way that these ideals are ingrained through state by things like language, by things like education, by things like the quotidian way that we live our everyday lives. The potential to oppress, ladies and gentlemen, is harmful enough. We say no more. We say long live anarchy.
Leader of the opposition, Matt, to open the case for first opposition.
Madam Speaker, we have a problem with the way that open government decide what they think is vague, what on. Because what they say is that this choice to be in a stadium does not exist and is a illegitimate choice because you are coerced in a variety of ways to make decisions. Right? The first and most problematic thing to know is that by their own logic, if we use the fact that you are coerced by some kind of abstract entity, state or otherwise, no choice anyone can ever make can truly be said to be free and rational. Why? Number of reasons. Firstly, because to the extent that you are coerced to make choices, I never consented to a whole variety of things which shape the decisions I make. Notably, I don't know, my own genetics, the ways in which I was raised, the environment I was raised in. Moreover, any decision I do make, even if I'm completely abstract, any kind of outside influence to make me decide on certain things, right, those choices are constrained by some kind of abstract morality, which even if I decide for myself or I don't, I still never consented to the particular set of moralities and ways in which I want to base those decisions, right? So we say no choice can never be made in a free and fair way. And even if you could make it in a free and fair way, the metrics by which you decide those choices are themselves constructed. So I think if you want to say this thing is illegitimate, then we say any particular choice you want to make is illegitimate, so we find that problematic. Perhaps a more persuasive claim they make is they say, here are a load of reasons why we think that states are bad and our alternative of like these small collectives but not too big is, somehow in some way better. So let's consider a couple of fallacies in the way in which they say that. They say, because what collectives do is they don't concentrate concentrate the power in the hands of the elite. Firstly, this is manifestly wrong, because if I want to form a collective in my, post-anarchy society, who am I going to form a collective with? I could form a collective with these poor people, or I could form a collective with the people who have resources that I need and that I can work. We say a good example of somewhere like vague as close to anarchy that we might want to use is like certain countries in Africa. So we say if I'm, in Somalia and I want to make some kind of collective problem, right? I don't say, oh, I'll help with these poor Somalis. What I do is I say, you've got AK-47s, he's got trucks, and this guy's got a busload of men with nothing better to do. So we're all a tribe, and now we control a few hundred square miles of Central Africa, right? This is a problem. But we say under their metric, we don't get any better situations because you have no incentive to help your common man. And what states do, even if not perfect, there's a downside better than what they want to give you. So, our contention is going to be, therefore, that given that choices are illegitimate, however you want to phrase them, that there is a pragmatic reason, no thank you Michael, why we think these states, or states in general, are a better way of maximising the choices that you can make, right? And a better way of maximising your ability to lead a happy and fulfilling life. Firstly, most obviously, collective action problems, right? I'm sure you're all expecting. Importantly, there are many things which you can do as an individual which would be problematic or bad for you in an individual sense, but if done with a large enough group of people, can actually be particularly helpful. The state is particularly good actor for ensuring that this happens. Good examples, trivially, are things like tax, right? I don't want to give up a portion of my income because it covers me, right? But through everyone giving up that portion of income, we're able to pool our resources and allocate them in the most effective way to protect our choices as a group, right? I have no incentive to build a road on my own because I bear all the costs, but lots of other people want to use that. So by forming a state, what it allows me to do is ensure that these things do happen and everyone benefits from them, and I do not bear all of the costs on my own. Clara tells us that no thank you, that even these collective problems are sometimes problematic. She gives us the example of education. So we're brainwashing a whole load of ideas. To the extent that that is true, which we just have to accept, right? We say having an education which brainwashes you to think in like a relatively specific way about a certain thing is still better under the comparative than having no education at all, because there's literally no incentive for some kind of abstract pursuit of higher knowledge or performing education or even creating schools in this kind of small collective anarchistic society she wants to tell us about. Right? We say in the state of nature, sorry, I used it, we have a race to the bottom in terms of what powerful people are willing to do to make their own ends meet. Because if I am the most powerful person in this anarchistic society, right, there is no one that can ever change or impinge on me what I want to do. Therefore, I want to race to the top to get the maximum amount of wealth and power that I can on my own. However, the way in which I do that is by taking resources and freedom and things like that off of other people. We know that the classic example would be something like slavery in the 17 and 1800s, where Western Europe went over to Africa, saw, without any kind of state control, they could literally do whatever they wanted and imported, I suppose, large numbers of people to form their building who had no rights and no protection that could basically do with whatever they want. In a state, at the very least, we have a lower bound to the ways in which we can treat people because we have a set of rights which allows us to decide specific things that we think no person can ever impinge upon. We think this is particularly important. We think states, moreover, have an incentive to do these things. We agree with Clara that maybe some laws are bad, maybe some laws are coercive, but it's a downside better than no laws at all. We think it's perfectly fine that I can coerce someone into being put in prison if they murder someone, or rape someone, or similar. No, thank you. So, on the notion of choices and maximising choices, because we say, as we said, without these, we have, I'll take you in a second, right? We say, without any kind of legitimacy in this sense, what we end up with, the person with the biggest gun decides the rules, right? They restrict your choices and restrict you from making the choices what you want to wear. It's very difficult in a collective society for this to happen because people can collectivize in things like unions, for example. We say the extent to which powerful people rule over the poor when they have no rights, slavery, is much better, much worse, I suppose. The ways in which people seem to treat people under the status quo, even if workers are poorly paid and have bad hours, they can still unionize and form some kind of reforms which they can never do under their moral code.
You say in the state of nature that the most powerful rush to stockpile resources. What kind of social mobility have we seen in the US or the UK or any other country over the last 50 years?
The US is a particularly good example. So quickly, we'll talk about why we think states have an incentive to kind of be nice. Because, you're right, as debaters, we can talk as much as we like and say, look, how terrible is it, there's this poverty, there are small groups of, small numbers of people who are truly disadvantaged And like, in the absolute sense, like people who are homeless, people who have almost near to no wealth. But the people who are living below the poverty line of the United States, we would suggest that under, their kind of anarchistic state of nature, which has no method for, coercing people into not keeping slaves as we identified, we say that being particularly poor and never being able to get out of your social stratification in the United States under the status quo is still probably better than being a slave and having no rights at all. We say rights, even if they're restricted and even if they're problematic, right, we still think it's much more important to have some kind of method and some kind of recourse if those are impinged, and we don't get those on their side of the house. So for all those reasons, it is.
And I now call upon Deputy Prime Minister Michael to continue the case for first proposition. Stand up. Step on.
Mr. Speaker, imagine a protection racket that not only enforced itself through the use of physical force, but defining your ability to consent to it before you even do so. Guess what? You live under it, and we resent that. A man said he wants to stop slavery. Mr. Speaker, we think that's a bit hypocritical coming from the side defending the state. The operations that endorsed slavery, that created the system that incentivized it, that failed to police it. We think we get a bottom on our side of the house. Three things in this speech. Legitimacy, what it means, why we get it. Secondly, justification, why we get that. Finally, consequences, and in particular, consequences for the worst off, something they've missed. First off, legitimacy, what it means. We think it is certainly a necessary condition for something being legitimate, that it secures the continuing benefit of society, plausibly understood in a broadly consequentialist sense, right? What we disagree with is that it is a sufficient condition. We say sufficiency means that your system must be capable of justification. That doesn't mean necessarily people all have to sign on the dotted line saying they agree with it, but it is a system that people can plausibly consent to, that they might possibly agree with, that you at least give them the scope to consent to. We say that doesn't happen on their side of the house. Importantly, in particular, in order to be legitimate, a system must justify itself to those who are left worse off by it, those who it instrumentalized to achieve its conception of the good. That's why, for instance, even if the mafia ran Queens pretty well for a while, its rule was still illegitimate because it was based on the use of force and because the people there knew nothing different. I mean, I think you've had time to make it clear. No thanks. Okay. These guys say, you don't have an alternative. Well, we do, right? People managed without states for many thousands of years, right? We have no thousands to suggest why that might plausibly be worse, right? Importantly, look, we don't think that necessarily, just because something has an alternative that is in a consequential sense worse, doesn't mean that it is necessarily illegitimate, doesn't mean it is necessarily legitimate, right? In the same way the mafia might not be the best people to run Queens, that doesn't mean they're legitimate in doing so, even if they lead to the best consequences. We think that's a distinction that's been made very clear. We backed up with lots of examples from other places in which we use the word, and that they fail to engage with in a substantive way, other than asserting that are different on the use of force, for God's sake. That should be pretty simple. Straightforward, right? We say examples of this do exist. There are small communities in which this has happened. The reason it has happened on a large scale might be that states have an incentive to continue their own propagation, ladies and gentlemen. We think that ought to be obvious, right? These guys say, no, all choice is illegitimate, guys. Consent can't matter in anything in life. First off, like prima facie bollocks, right? But more importantly, there's a clear difference between all choices being subject to influence, which is obvious, right? Even I got that, I'm a mathematician. Right? It is the people who are shaping your choices, are the biggest role in shaping that choice, right? Are the very people whom you are supposed to be consenting to, right? Recognize the fact the state has a huge role in shaping people's preferences about the state before they have an opportunity to express those. That's the problem, right? That those preferences are shaped by the very actor in question. Unresponsive. Let's talk about justification, right? But we told you, if you see no response, the state primarily justifies its power by force, right? The reason you obey the laws is because you're afraid not to, because you fear being incarcerated and the sort of abuse that brings with it. Of course, sometimes it's not entirely likely that you'll be caught, okay? But people still fear that, right? The state tricks people into thinking that robbers get caught. They tell people that from a very young age, that enormous importance of things like education, like the media, and to some extent, look, it's just self-propagating, right? If lots of people believe it, they will continue to pass it on, right? That means that people unjustifiably fear the fact they'll be caught when they break the law. As such, they're coerced by the threat of being put into obeying that without the opportunity to consent. Finally, saying if you don't believe that, social taboo is a thing, and there is a social taboo to breaking the law, and it's self-reinforcing. It does stop people doing so. Right? Importantly, we don't think they get to make a choice in the matter. We think people are coerced into it. We think that is illegitimate. But more importantly, even if you don't have any of that, the state still shapes the way in which you constitute your views on everything. Clara told you how. It does it for things like the education, when it shapes curricula, when it shapes curricula to reinforce constructive language, it puts forward specific views on the state, see last round. When it puts forward things that through the media, right, when elites that control the media, right, who are massively benefited by the state, obviously, there's the fact that Rupert Murdoch isn't doing too well out of good old corporation US of A, right? Who are, of course, to put forward that notion, to put forward the notion that disagreeing with the state is disorderly, that it is taboo, that it is wrong. Thirdly, things like political people, right, politicians who are given a massive platform and you're able to put forward a view that they're the father of the nation and that you should buy into them and that you should believe in them. Right? And finally, it's self-propagating. Everyone believes it, they continue to believe it. The state sets up mechanisms for people to pass these viewpoints on. As such, people's capacity to consent to the state, to even find it justifiable and even shape the state, is already shaped by the state and the elites that benefit from it before they even have a chance to think about it. We think that it makes consent utterly impossible. Hannah, you're ready to go.
Okay, so you say that everybody doesn't have to agree in your state, and that people we have to believe that there is a plausible reason for them to think that they can benefit. So if we propose to you our view of the state where people can plausibly benefit, we win?
So you haven't done that. I'm already saying the mechanism for deciding what is plausible is already shaped by the state. Right? And the thing that they always have in mind is the fact that the state is able to influence what it wants by coercion. They can't conceive of disobeying with it. That's why there's a taboo around things like civil disobedience, because it is seen as breaking a norm, it is seen as taboo. No. Secondly, the state propagates itself by oppression, right? It instrumentalizes a certain group in order to ensure its own propagation. Importantly, we think it's the groups who justifies itself. Least, we think these are the groups who are least involved in political processes, who are least encouraged to be involved in political processes, who are less given the information necessary to get involved in those political processes. What sort of oppression do we need? Capital versus labour, true in 99.5% of countries, right? The other one's North Korea, right? Secondly, tropes of oppression, right? We think they're oppressive constructs filtered through society, right? About things like femininity, about values and things like race, which the state helps to propagate in order to ensure its own power. More importantly, we think it distributes resources according to certain prejudicial tropes and amplifies those through its distribution of resources. See the fact that the average black family in the US has a household net worth of $5,000, whereas the average white family has one of $100,000, right? Thirdly, it does this through political discourse, through various tropes that we conceive of as oppressive to benefit the elites that control the state. Even if you don't like that, United States aren't always oppressive. They have the potential to magnify oppressive tropes by putting one group in power who has a direct incentive to continue the oppression of the groups who are instrumentalized in maintaining their power. We say that it is such a dangerous construct, it simply cannot exist on that basis, right? These guys say, oh, collective action points. Happiness is a relative thing, guys. We say the very notion that people have happiness is shaped by the state and the elites that control them, see for consumerism. We don't think that stands. So they say, no, guys, protection of rights. Look, on our side of the house, people can form collective militias, they can ostracize people who do bad things, but they can still get effective enforcement of these sorts of things. The difference is, there is one organisation, an elite that controls enforcing everything through its monopoly on the use of force. We say that is too much power to put in the hands of one organisation, and on that basis, we're exceptionally proud to stand in government. Thank you.
best 300 years. The emergence of the modern nation state has coincided with a couple of things. The dying away of the worst forms of slavery, the increase in the number of democracies around the world, a decrease in interstate wars, the emergence of modern medicine, and the emergence of widespread university education. We don't think these things are purely coincidental. And if they want to tell us that, well, happiness itself is constructed by the state, they're removing any possibility for a reasonable debate to even happen. My think we premise on certain beliefs about human nature I think are universal and not constructed by the state. Beliefs like, I want to see my loved ones safe. Beliefs like, I think it is legitimate if someone tries to rape my wife, that the state, with a monopoly on power, throws him in jail. Universal truths like people want stuff because it allows them barter to gain happiness. We don't think these values are constructed. They need to tell us why these values are constructed. It was fun, but dishonest for them to assert that this was true. So, we're going to talk about a couple of things, right? So, firstly, we're going to get quite a lot about the stuff they say. Secondly, I want to talk about why and collective action forms are solved in the way that states can. Thirdly, I want to talk about why states uniquely align the interests of the best and the worst of in society. That's the reason why it's rather bad for you as a state to keep a large number of people as slaves, because they would live much happier and productive lives that benefit everyone if they were not slaves. That's the reason why states tend not to want to have these sorts of things. So firstly, that's a bit of stuff they told us. They said, well, in order for us to say that something is morally legitimate, we need to have some way of reaching saying, well, even if you don't sign on the dotted line, so they're conceding they don't want perfect choice, right? We said, well, you need to have some capacity to at least meaningfully evaluate a choice and make some decisions. We think people can do that. We think the average American can look at a person living in North Korea and he can say, well, compared to that person, I think my life is actually a heck of a lot better, right? I think if you ask people in Somalia and in the worst places in North Korea whether or not their lives are good, they would say, I would still rather not live in this state. I think people have lots of fairly objective metrics that states just can't manipulate away. And even then, let's talk about their communes, right? Because even when they create a small commune, you have an even smaller diversity of views, an even smaller plurality of discussion that occurs in a large state where people have different lifestyle and different things they like, right? Like the commune of people who believe in anarcho-capitalism is probably going to be quite oppressive to people who are left-wing, right? So small communes are often even more nasty to people they don't like than big groups of people who need to find some way to reach a compromise. So again, we don't think they gave us a truly good analysis on that thing. We said, well, it's not morally legitimate to punish people. I mean, yeah, it's pretty legitimate to punish a large number of people. In fact, right, if the state is monopoly on force, it just gets better at stopping murderers and rapists from coming out and brutalizing me and my family and the people I love. If you're going to tell me that it's just intrinsically evil to educate people from a young age that rape is bad, even if, in fact, society and biology have like conditioned us to often be to think it that way, I think it's fine. I think there's some bits of human nature that are intrinsically quite nasty, and it's good for states to try and educate out of us. So thank you. Why is it that states can do this? Because the modern nation state doesn't just randomly choose what it wants, right? The modern nation state picks from thousands of years of moral experimentation in ways in which we try to set up societies. When those states collapse, people go, well, that was a bad way of doing things. Why don't we try doing something different? That's why human states are often quite good at choosing what to do with people. It's not good enough when it comes, well, we'll just let people like guess and whatever political system is good and they'll come to the right answer. They tried doing that. That was what happened before the 1600s when people weren't very happy. But past that point now, they set a state pass, right? No, thank you. Right? They say, well, we brainwash individuals. Firstly, as I said, it's not clear why changing the choices of individuals in this way is okay. Right? It's not okay. But in any case, we think if you want to best convince people that your values as a state are the truly correct ones, it's often not very sustainable to just brainwash them, because people tend to see through that. It's a lot better for you to tell people the reasons why you choose something, point people to other places where they've tried something different and it hasn't worked. It's a lie to suggest that Americans are brainwashed into thinking democracy is good. Americans have to explain to them why democracy is good, why countries that are not democracies are considerably worse, right? So it's not like people just blindly, like just idiots, follow whatever the state tells them. There are reasons that people interact with. So again, that was a bit silly. In fact, they said, well, capital-labor division. We are happy to say capitalism probably made people a lot happier. Why? People want stuff. The amount of stuff people want is smaller than the amount of stuff that exists in the world. We need to find some way to ensure that those people who have better need for stuff are able to get the stuff, and that stuff is used efficiently, so that idiots don't get the stuff. Capitalism ensures that stuff gets used efficiently, because if you're inefficient, your profit margin increases. Now, is capitalism perfect? Absolutely not, right? However, net, the average person right now has a lot more stuff than a peasant living in the 1600s. So even if it's imperfect and people like Michael exist, it's a pity, but it's still alright, people's lives have to be better. No thank you.
Your value is not just to defend rape prevention, but something resembling the modern state. You only engage with 0.1% of what that entity actually does.
I think the vast majority of the state's laws are actually quite good. So, here are some examples I'm quite familiar with. Don't speed because you like trashing people who die. Don't murder because people die. Don't steal because people work hard to get their stuff and you shouldn't take it away from them. Don't rape because what the economy is a big. fashionably anarchist states actually did much harm. Also, response to collective action from not to say, well, states lie to people what they want. Now, that neglects the analysis of games, right? That's in the role that people act according to individual incentives. Those individual incentives conflict with other people's actions. I have no need to provide an army to defend the state or to provide a hospital, because other people benefit from that, but I bear all the cost of creating that. The state comes to break that deadlock by saying, I'm just going to force all of you guys to do it, and actually, even though you would not have done it without this course schools, all of you are now a lot better, right? We think it is good when people have schools and hospitals. But also, states align the interests of the worst and best people. The modern measure of the power of a nation state is economic progress. If you want to economically progress, you lift people out of poverty. That's why China has seen 500 million people being lifted out of poverty. If you want to do that, you try and maximize the capacity for people to exercise their skills, for people to express their individual identities. Again, that's why China is trying to do things like cut back pollution and destroying the lives of people. That's why slavery is quite bad, because slaves don't get very much chance to exercise their talents. And states want people to be able to exercise their talents and use them in a way that makes everyone else's lives better. So we think states have lots of incentives to be nice to people, and as we find the most powerful nation state in history is also a democracy. For all these reasons, I'm very proud.
I'd like to thank Ashish for his speech. Before moving on, I'd just like to remind people to keep the noise down in general. Like, it can be quite distracting for speakers and judges, so please be aware of that. So that being considered, I call upon Member of the Government, Michelle, to present.
Communes, however, can come together and have minority communes and don't have to be part of that state that dictates to them. We say we get a benefit in terms of we don't necessarily need a plurality of voices. No thanks. Okay, first of all, state aims and why they're always at the expense of the individual. Because the state aim, its sole aim, is the continuation of that state, the maintenance of that state. That will always be its sole goal, right? So what does that mean to the individual? No thanks, right? It means that it will stifle you and put you into the conveyor belt system it wants, right? So it does educate you in a certain way and have education policies that pushes you towards a certain way, such as its capitalist ideals, right? So it forces you then to be educated, to get a job, so it can get as much out of you as possible. It can get as much money out of you as possible, whether that's the right thing for you or not, right? We'd say that like, it creates that culture of deference towards authority state through its education policies. See the last debate, right? We'd say that we don't think that you get as much out of that as possible, and rather are stifled in that you have to conform to that system, you have to be educated, you have to get a job, and you have to buy into that state, and if you don't, you end up homeless, and you get no benefits at all, and people don't associate with you, because you're outside of that state, you're on the margins, right? We'd also say that on another basic level, your civil liberties are restricted, right? We'd also say like all of the classical freedom stuff in terms of the fact that you can't do what you want in those states. You are restricted as an individual on that very basis. Like we point to the fact the NSA is constantly watching you. The police can stop you from doing things that you want to do. On a basic level, you can't be who you want to be, and your behavior is modified. The state needs to survive by keeping the people who have power happy, right? That Matt says. We'd say that just isn't true. We'd also say that the middle classes are still harmed for all the stuff I just talked to you about, in having to act in a certain way, in having to buy into that system they don't necessarily agree to, alright? So what does the state give us in return that makes it worth it, right? Apparently security. Security to feel secure. But we'd say that that isn't what happens, right? We don't have riots just because police aren't there, right? We'd say that the London riots, for example, didn't just happen because there weren't enough police hanging around to keep you in order. They happened because people were unhappy with that system. People are subjugated and people don't have access to the things that they talk about, right? We'd say that, no thanks. We'd say that once you have a system that is based on having powerful people and powerless people, because that is what a state is. You have to give control of that state to some people
same lifetime as the lifetimes of most people in this room, we can trace the progress of human history through change from states, ways in which our lives have become better. When we were born, roughly around the same time we were all born, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. People taking ownership of a state that existed and saying, we want something different, we want to be able to control a state and make it something better so that we can live our lives. We've seen the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. We've seen the beginnings of YouTube, something that's protected by the idea of property rights. Why is that important? Because states uphold property rights in a way that anarchy, which is what they tell you about our proposition, simply cannot. Why is YouTube important? Because it's an example of how states have modernized, how they've responded to the demand from ordinary people on the ground to give them free information, to give them greater power, greater access to accountability for the institutions which they therefore have greater ownership of now than they ever did before. We say that this debate isn't simply about states being bad and something else that's unnamed being good, even though they can't paint a reality in which that's the case, because we've simply never found it to be so. We say that it's about the fact that we can take ownership of the states that are there, and they don't want to engage in that on proposition. Let's talk about a few things. Firstly, this conception of legitimacy, because we don't think that we've got a clear idea of what legitimacy is in this debate. In the first proposition, the first speaker, we were told that you have to be free from coercion. So we say, firstly, that a state probably isn't so much a system of coercion as a system of prioritization. But insofar as there must always be somebody who's in a minority who disagrees with what the majority wants, then we're willing to say that that person is coerced in that particular instance by the state, even though the state is probably good for them in the vast majority of cases overall. But by their logic, if they don't want states, if they want everyone to live as individuals or identifying small individual communes, then the individual who does want a state is fundamentally oppressed by their logic. That makes not having a state actually illegitimate, using the logic that they started off in the beginning. That means, if that's true, nothing is legitimate, and we should all just shoot ourselves in the head. Taking that not to be their intention, are going to suggest that it was probably closer to what we heard in the second speaker from the first proposition, that, we want something about happiness, something that people can plausibly consent to. Now it's beginning to sound a lot like a state. Now it's beginning to sound not like something we can go and vote for, something which becomes a little bit legitimate, which we opt into a little bit when we start using its free education or start using its healthcare, when we start owning some small amount of property and relying on that state. We can say we don't like it, but the simple fact is that at that point you are opting into it because you are choosing to use its structures, and we think that's very important. We think the idea that the charge that's leveled at us by proposition that we simply can't conceive of something else is fundamentally untrue. I started this speech by giving you examples of protests, by giving you examples of states not only being changed, but being toppled, by being replaced with other structures which people found to be better. The funny thing is that they always replaced with the state some other form of a state that they could take a greater form of ownership over. So we think that this debate isn't so much about states or not states, it's about whether or not we can claim ownership of what actually exists. And we said that increasingly, in the real world, which nobody seems to want to talk about in this debate, but we talk about it, in the real world, increasingly, we can and we do. We vote, we strike, we migrate. We think that we do all of these things increasingly, and this shows that as individuals we have power. Ladies and gentlemen, sure, we were given some things by lottery. We were given our families by lottery, and they sustained us this far. And in any system or non-system that they want, that's still going to be the case. However, we don't think that makes that structure illegitimate. We say that it's one which fundamentally benefits us, one which we somewhat opt into when we decide, as we grow older, to still stay connected with that family in the vast, vast majority of cases. We think that simply saying that we didn't choose it in the very first instance is not enough to say it's not legitimate. Let's talk, about the fact that there are some things that everybody in this room wants to talk about as being fundamental to humans. So, for example, not wanting to be killed, not wanting to be killed by someone else, not wanting your stuff stolen. We say that the only system which can prioritize and uphold those fundamental rights, which we hold to be true and apply to all individuals in all circumstances, is the state. Because any other system necessarily prioritizes some other form of upholding power. Because we say that if their problem here is with elites and with power, those elites and that power will always exist. No thank you. Because the idea is that if you have anarchy, then what rules? Force rules. They want to talk about how this is bad for women or any other particular group that they choose. I would think that the people who are going to do best in anarchy are the people with the greatest brute force, the people who are best able to force me, like, to hand over my stuff, because the alternative is much gorier. It's me losing my arm or something like that. What we therefore want is a system which gives the most people the greatest level of control possible. We recognise, therefore, that what they fail to see in proposition is that you can't avoid a system where some level of compromise has to happen. In our state system, we said that compromise can happen through discussion, through negotiation, through the sharing of information, and at a ballot box where everybody's treated equally. In anarchy, it's by the loudest voice, by the guy with the biggest muscle, the person with the most arms. We think, therefore, it shows us that has to happen. We'd rather that happens in a situation where everybody has a greater chance to have an input, because we say that therefore you aggregate that happiness in the best way possible.
We think that your preference for someone else to have a monopoly on the use of force is of considerably less direct import than everyone's right to be free of coercion, both physical and psychological.
Okay.
Why do you disagree?
Okay, well, I talked about coercion at the start, but here's the kick. Reality coerces us. The fact that you want to stay alive and beyond the next morning coerces us. The fact that cavemen woke up 3-4 times a night in order to make sure that somebody wasn't outside stealing their few possessions, was coercive. But we think that that's a less good coercion than a state which sometimes makes me pay taxes that I'd rather not pay, when I can sleep for 10 hours. Hell, I can sleep for 3 days on end after the Trinity ID if I want to. It's very important to acknowledge that what happens is not that we all get perfect control over our lives all the time, because we're not all God. That would be mental. What we are suggesting is that we do get a greater level of control over that life. This final idea then that we got from closing, that states are simply self-sustaining elites and they always strive to sustain themselves. If that were true, we're not sure firstly why states get toppled, but secondly why some states are incredibly left-wing and some states are incredibly right-wing. If there was a really good way of keeping people down, we'd imagine they'd all do the same. As it happens, it sounds like Michelle just doesn't like capitalism, and maybe she'd be okay with communist states in any case. Look, and in the end of the day, this is a debate about what makes your life most utile, what allows you to do the most stuff. We say that's a system where fundamental rights are protected to, still alive, where you have the greatest possible level of choice. A compromise between what I want and what he wants is going to happen anyway. I'd rather we did it at a ballot box and with someone with the most force getting whatever they want every time. We have
Here in this room, we have a bunch of university-educated people in one of the richest states in the world, telling us about how great life is under a state. Yay! I don't bring you down, but you should be ashamed of yourself. What Michelle and I think is that the state cares most about perpetuating its own existence, often at the expense of the poorest, but also at the expense of, the trampled middle classes or whatever you want to call it. Because this negatively affects everybody. In order to achieve this, it uses a variety of coercive and oppressive mechanisms which makes the lives of the majority of the citizens manifestly worse. Perhaps not materially, but then we don't care as much as you do about the material aspects of your life. I guess that means we're better than you, but we're better more than that. For this reason, we reject the legitimacy of the state. We say, in effect, to live free or die hard. apparent benefits that they claim the state gives us, and why these are not, in fact, as good as they say effectively. So firstly, we would say the way the state shapes your life, right? Because the state cares most about its continuation, it molds its citizens to that, right? Stuff like the education system, like that makes you work as just another drone in the economic system that the state has decided is best for that state, right? Now that mostly means pissing your life away in a dead-end job in the service of neoliberal capitalism, but we're equally sure that life under communism was pretty bad as well, right? Like, we think the state forces you whatever system it has decided to create for its own benefit, right? It all it gives you is that illusion of choice. Like the idea that you can choose between this job and that. Like you're still working in a system you didn't agree to, which isn't to your benefit, but to the benefit of that wealthy few. We think it grinds out of you the life that you could have lived had that yoke not been upon you, right? But furthermore, we think as well as this, like just as well as that, like horrifically grinding system, you also have the actual intrusion of the state upon like the crap life that the state gives you. The stuff like the NSA, stuff like lack of privacy, just the way the state is constantly encroaching upon the freedoms the few freedoms that its decided to give you. Like we think people would be happier were they not in this situation. Right? There's a couple of reasons here. Right? Even if you're materially worse off than the state, like at least you are living that life for yourself. Right? We don't think the lack of new iPhones is a price that's too high to pay to be able to make our own choices. But even within that, right, we don't necessarily think that you'll be like hugely disadvantaged by this, or at least the majority of people will be hugely disadvantaged. Like look, Michelle tells you that we've only had side opposition tell us that we've only had a state for a couple of hundred years. Yet in that time, we have seen resources flow to the incredibly few at the expense of the incredibly many. Like we don't think that's a good change, right? So when Ashish comes up and talks about social mobility, as she says, like, well, obviously the state is good for the poor because it wants them to flourish, so it gives them education and things like that. We ask, is that actually borne out by the distribution of resources that we see in any state you care to mention? Like typically, the poorest get the worst education, right? It's almost as if the state doesn't care about them much and only wants to give them enough education to be able to do the worst jobs, because the state needs people like that to do these awful jobs in order for the state itself to go on, right? We don't think that's a good outcome for the vast majority of people, right? What's then second opposition call, and what they add to this basically is saying, well, you know, even if your life is crap, at least you have some kind of control now, right? And you're able to change the state. Let's look at how Michael tells us that we can change the state. He gives us a couple of things. You can migrate, you can vote, or you can have a strike or a revolution, which are vaguely equated. They're probably the same thing, right? So let's just go through it, right? Like the choice he actually gives us is migration, meaning leave your home and your family behind forever, which we think is perhaps an unreasonable choice to force them to make in order to just have a couple more freedoms than they might want currently. A revolution or a strike, which usually the state tries its very best to actually shut down as best it possibly can. Like, obviously the strikes don't take that, but like most revolutions end as rebellions, i.e. in your death and your guts being thrown around. You don't completely your control mechanism if the state is trying to kill you at every moment of that control mechanism. Like, how on earth is that a good control mechanism to have? But finally he tells us, well, you can have a vote. We applaud his idealism, right? But we're not entirely sure that the vote actually changes anything, right? Like, look at all the restrictions the state places on it in the first place. You must have money or connection to become elected. Like, look at the restriction it actually creates on voting itself. Like voter ID laws in the states, where they're often manifestly either against like a certain race or socioeconomic background, right? Even if you succeed in getting someone actually like elected, like what good is one politician? This is a genuine question. Like, when does anything good happen from this? Like, we don't buy this as a control mechanism. Like, without a state, at least we aren't controlled at all, right? Michael, we don't think he has enough faith. We can all be gods if only side opposition would trust us to it.
Right, so your executive speaker said he was happy for these communes to create and enforce extensive criminal codes that presumably require some kind of hierarchy. So are you happy with large-scale institutional coercion, or are you happy for Reverend murder to be widespread?
Surprisingly, neither. The state apparently gives us work, right? So, firstly, as she says, well, the state can create we ask, why would you rely on the state to give you those values when the state is just a conglomeration of views that if it calls its state itself a state, you have to obey, right? Like, if we lived in a village in India last week, we would have to accept an authority wrong just like people, right? At least if you were not under a state, you would not have to accept it when it was manifestly wrong. At least you would not have to accept the authority of the state if it's just as fallible as any group of people. It's ridiculous, right? The second thing they give us is talk about general riots and chaos, right? We don't think things like riots are inevitable. Look, Michelle tells you when London riots were broadly a response to being downtrodden. We think it was rational for people to riot in London because they said knew the state didn't care about them. Finally, the state, when the state says that this threats national borders, we say having borders divides people to keep them out because they are different. It's to purpose to lose the thread of our common humanity, instead to hate or fear other people. That is the crux of the state. To hate and fear your neighbour, to hate and fear people in the country beside you. We do not think that we should rely on something that relies so heavily on hatred and on fear. I beg to close.
People form collectives because they want to achieve greater things. It is hard to build a dam if you're on play a game of football if you're on your own. People like collectives. People hate human nature. So they say, oh no, they're small. The problem with small collectives is it's very hard to get change because you necessarily get fewer ideas circulating. One good thing about having lots of people in the room is you're probably going to have lots of opinions. Also, when you have already decided to aggregate based on common values, that common value becomes quite a strong bond, so you're necessarily not going to get discussion about that common value. That's problematic if your common value is, we think women are terrible, let's just oppress them. That's problematic if your small commune necessarily doesn't take the rights of everyone into account. That is less likely under a state. We think that the states have oppressed people at times in history. But recognize that Obama is a black president of the United States. Like, I'm really sorry guys, you might hate him, but that's social mobility staring you in the face. We think that necessarily things can change with this, when we have some sort of on the stage, because we have a principle in mind that we need to cater for all people. We need to provide some sort of framework, and we have a multiplicity of views who are going to stand up in some sort of way. That doesn't happen when you're a small force. Let's talk about legitimacy, ladies and gentlemen. We do not, Michael fundamentally brought you this question. If it is just about individuals, right, you can never be legitimate. Because you are never going to have a system whereby an individual who wants to be on their own is happy when another individual says, but I'd like it if we could be friends. I mean, they're mutually exclusive, right? So in that circumstance, you're always going to have a system of compromise. Look at it another way. There are like 7 billion people on the earth, a bit more, even 1 million people in Dublin. You are never going to be able to say, we can all be fine and happy together, maybe we'll want the same piece of land. We're necessarily going to need a system of compromise. So compromise in and of itself can't be illegitimate unless you're saying we should just cease to exist. And we think that something that ends in death isn't like a reason for it to be legitimate. We think that necessarily we get things in return for our government, something that's been like disregarded from their social house. Please.
Even if states change, it's still going to be the same elites there, the same subjugate, and they're still going to divide people from within the state and without the state.
Okay.
All the divides are still there.
You have a really weird definition of change if you think the same people are necessarily going to be there. But like, fundamentally, the English aren't in Ireland anymore. Communists don't rule in like the Eastern, in like Hungary anymore. We think that often you're right. Like, if you look at Egypt, they've come back. Change takes some time. The state can do that, ladies and gentlemen, because fundamentally, and I'll get on to my third point about human nature, which is that a state, because it is large, has an institutional memory, so it can learn. Harder to do in a commune because you've bonded over these select values, because there are fewer people. Necessarily within a state, because it's large, you can get separation of powers, so you can have more questioning. Necessarily, we think, as I've already said, people do aggregate into communities. Further than that, people aggregate in terms of hierarchies. So when you get 5 people, someone is going to try to assert themselves as the best. The problem is, when you don't have a system that says, we need diplomacy, we think we should talk about politics, we think we should talk about rights, it's always going to be about brute strength, because that's the easiest way to win. And that very definitely leaves people out. This system is legitimate because it gives the most possible people a chance of engaging within that system. So if you just think about the organisation level, the logistics, we have a policy we want to enact. We can't do that with 1 million people. We should have a select committee, but we should have that committee formed through debate, and we should have many people inputting, like through a vote, as we possibly can. That is probably the best compromise we can think of in a system that needs compromises. Recognise fundamentally, as I've already said, in a commune, you can self-select your values. So we all agree this, we should live together, we'll be happy. That never allows for a system where we believe fundamental rights are important. Recognise that in the USA, slavery is no longer acceptable. And it was for a long time, and the state perpetrated that. It also learned, and it also meant that even when individuals disagreed with it, it wasn't allowed to continue. States can do that. They can enforce, they can learn, and they can provide a universal truth. Because there is a universality and a commonality when you all have to compromise. You do not get that when every individual is allowed to decide what is right. We beg you to oppose.